So you can go ahead and share your screen.
All right. Okay, guys, can you see my screen? Amaka, I don't know. I know they are muted. Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can see your screen.
Okay, all right. Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Timothy. Timothy Kobo, and I'm a front-end engineer. I want to first of all thank the organizers of this program for giving me the opportunity to share my knowledge and provide value to the learners. Yeah, it's an opportunity, and I hope that we're going to have a very good session. In the next 1 hour. So in the next 1 hour, I'm going to be talking about working with Provide-inject. In Vue.js, there is what is known as state management. And I'm sure, considering your curriculum and considering the topic that we're looking at now, I'm sure that you must have been introduced to the basics of state management in Vue.js applications. Now, when you are working with states, when you're working with data in a Vue.js application, there is usually one problem that you can face. And that has to do with the concept known as props drilling. Now, what props drilling means is, when you are working in a Vue.js application, you create components. And then most of the times you can pass data to your components using props. Now, there are times in our applications where you can be in a situation where you are passing props down too many levels deep. So for example, you can have, like in this diagram, I have this component called root, and inside of root, I'm rendering a component called footer. And inside of footer, I'm rendering a component called deep child. And if you notice, based on the flow on the diagram, you can see that props are being passed from root to footer, but footer is not using the props. Instead, it is transferring the props downwards to deep child. So this concept of having to pass props down several levels deep is what is referred to as props drilling. And in Vue.js, there are various ways by which you can avoid, props drilling in your application. And one of the ways is through Provide-inject. At the end of this class, I'm going to mention the alternatives. Like if you weren't going to use Provide-inject, what would you have used? And when will it be better to go with, since there are other alternatives to avoiding props drilling, when would it be better for you to choose, to use Provide-inject compared to the other alternatives? And then when will it be better to use the alternatives compared to Provide-inject? So I hope that explanation of props drilling is clear. So here, what is props drilling? Props drilling is the passing down of props from a parent component to one or more nested child components. So the flow of this class is, I have the slides here. I'm going to do the discussion here, and then I have, so that it will not just be all talks, I'll be toggling also. I have like a basic Vue.js application that I just scaffolded. It's empty. So I'll just do some practice here, some demonstrations of the concept that we're going to be discussing about. So props drilling is not a good practice and should always be avoided. So let's see what props drilling is all about. So as you can see here now, we have a parent component, and the component, is importing a child component, and the component has a data called username. And then the child component is rendered here, and then the username is passed down, as a prop to the child component. And now looking at the child component, this child component, looking at its internal implementation, it's importing a grandchild component, and then the prop that it received, it is registering the prop internally, and then it is passing the prop down to the grandchild component. Now, if you notice, the prop that this component received, it did not use it anywhere else other than transferring it downwards, right? And so the grandchild component also receives the prop and then gets to use it down here, gets to use the prop. So this is the concept of props drilling, where a component receives the prop, doesn't get to use it, but instead passes it downwards, passes it downwards to components that actually need them. This design pattern, is something that when you are just beginning to code in Vue.js, you might find yourself, in situations where you're actually doing this, and it's not a good thing. It's not a good sign, so it should be avoided, and that's why we are having this class. You might be thinking, okay, if you look at the slide, I'm calling this guy parent component, child component, grandchild component. In the real world, you wouldn't be naming your components parent, child, grandchild, right? But this is just a demonstration. This is just like pass the information across. So in the real world scenario, there are times when you could actually find yourself dealing with props drilling. For example, imagine you have an application where let's say you have a list, user, component, right? This list user component internally, renders a user. So let's say this list user component makes an API call, right? So it fetches, users, right? It fetches users from an API server, and then internally it does like a v-for. So it then renders, the user component, and then via a v-for, right? And then while it renders a component, it passes each user. So we can say that this user component has like a prop called user, and then you just in the v-for logic, let's say the v-for could have been something like v-for user in users, where users could have come from the API endpoint, and then vbind user is equal to user. And then internally, now this is not props drilling. Internally, the user component, this user component internally could then render the user prop that it is receiving, that is this prop here, could render it. And then it's possible that internally this user component, part of the information that it renders could also be that it renders, let's say, the user net worth. And it's possible that this component, this user component, actually uses another component to render the user net worth. Let's say we call it user net worth component, right? Internally, it uses this component to sort of render the user net worth. Now, let's say that this user net worth component actually displays the net worth of a user in decimal places. Okay, so we have the user net worth component, and it renders the net worth of a user, but it actually, sometimes the net worth of a user could be, let's say, $2 million, but sometimes it could be 2-point-something million dollars. Okay, so it actually uses a decimal place to render the net worth of users. And it's possible that sometimes it uses 1 decimal place, sometimes it uses 2 decimal place. So the question is, how will this user net worth component know whether it is to use 1 decimal place or 2 decimal place? It's possible that upwards here, in this list user component, we could have like a select drop down, a drop down of, we could have like a select drop down, right, with a lot of options where you can have like where the user can sort of choose whether they want 1 decimal place or 2 decimal place or 3 decimal place. Okay. Now, it will make sense. You probably will be asking, okay, if the user network component needs decimal place data to sort of know whether it is to use 1 decimal place or 2 decimal place, why don't we have this select drop down inside of user network? Well, it wouldn't make sense because if we have like 10 users, then we'll be having 10 of those select drop downs. If we have like 100 users, we'll be having 100 of those select drop downs because the user network component is being rendered inside of the user component that is a for loop. So it makes a lot of sense to have this state upwards so that it can be rendered once, and then the information can now be passed down, via the list user component, and then down to the user component, and then down to the user network component. So you might not find yourself in a situation where the list user component, right, depending on what the user has selected, it takes whether it is 1 decimal place or 2 decimal place, and then passes it down to this component. So it's possible that user component could also be accepting another prop called decimal place. Could be accepting another prop called decimal place, but it doesn't get to use it. Instead, it passes it down, to the user network component. So this is a very good use case of having to pass a prop to a component that it doesn't need, and then it just passes it down to a component that actually needs it. So this design pattern is what is referred to as props drilling. So even though I have used parent component, child component, grandchild components, it's just to give you a mental model of how props drilling can occur in your application. Okay, introducing Provide-inject. Now, one of the ways you can avoid props drilling is with Provide-inject. A parent component can serve as a dependency provider for all its descendants. So how do we implement Provide-inject? So in Provide-inject, you have the parent component, looking at this instance now, so we have a parent component that imports provide from view. This is a keyword. It must be called provide. And then it imports a child component, and then it has this reactive data. And then notice this line, provide, username. Now, provide takes 2 arguments. The first one is the key, and then the second one is the value. So this means that we are providing this username, this reactive data, we are providing it, but the key, the way it will be accessed in the consuming component is via this key. So it means that the consuming components, we need to look out for this key, username, so that I can now use it to access, this value here that is stored via this reactive data. Now, if you notice, unlike in the previous example, where we needed to pass the props down here, because now we are dealing with Provide-inject, notice that the child component does not even receive any props. Instead, in the child, now looking at the child component's internal implementation, it is importing the grandchild component, calling it without passing any props. So there's nothing like props drilling here. And then going to where we actually need that data, the grandchild, where the data is needed, imports inject from view. Now it wants to access this data that was provided. So what it does is to create a variable. So username is equal to inject username. This username that's here is actually the key through which the data was provided. So by saying inject username, what what will be returned, right, is this value here that was injected, username, which is actually Mirabel123. And then the grandchild component can now go ahead and then render username. So I'm just going to let me just quickly demonstrate this. So let me just, so here I have like a parent component. I'll just quickly, let's say we have a script, right? And then let's use script setup since we are dealing with composition API. And then I'm going to import ref from view. And then I'm also going to import provide. And then I'm going to create a reactive variable. So const username is equal to, let's say, Mirabel123 ref. And then I'm going to provide using the key username. I'm going to provide this username. Okay. And then let's also, so here we have a child component. So let's import it. So import child from child.view. And then in our template, and get to render child. Now going into child. So here, what I've done here is to import ref and provide from view, import this child component, create a reactive data, and then using provide, I'm trying to like pass this reactive data to wherever it is going to be consumed. And then I'm importing the child component and I'm rendering it. Now going into the child component, let's see what it does is to import the grandchild component, and then all it just does is in the template is to render the grandchild. Okay. And then going to where we actually need the data. So in the grandchild component, we have a script. Then we import inject. Import inject from view. And then const username is equal to inject. And what was injected is held by the key username. And then in the template, and now render username, and let's see if that works. So I think I have it started somewhere. Aha, yeah. So let me close this. So you can see that in the parent component, we are providing this reactive value, and then via using provide, and then in the grandchild, where we need it, we are injecting username. So if I come here to the parent and let's say I change this to, let's say, Fred123, it changes in the grandchild. So this is the concept of Provide-inject. I did not have to pass this username as a prop to child, and then inside of child, I will now pass it down to grandchild, and then grandchild will now accept it, and then render it. So this is the basic syntax of Provide-inject. You use provide to pass a key, and then pass the value, and then in wherever you need it, you just inject using the key that was used to provide the data. providing default values. So you can pass a second argument to inject. It will be used as the default value if the key is not provided by any of the parent components. So what does that mean? So if you notice here, the parent component, there's nothing like provide here. So the parent component is not providing anything. However, the child component is expecting that username will be injected. Okay? But it's also passing a second argument, Fred123. Now, what this means is that give me username if it's there, if it's provided, but if it's not provided, use this as the default value. So what this means is that the value of username here will actually be Fred123. So this second value that you're passing is a default value that will be used if this key was never provided by the parent component. So we can test that out. So let's say that the parent component did not actually provide anything. Now, if I save, okay, you see there's nothing there. But if I go back to the grandchild, I can say, okay, I want to inject username, but if it's not there, use this. And then that works, right? So the second argument that you provide, that you supply to inject, will be used if the key was not provided at all. So that's how we get to provide default values to provide inject. Now, how to ensure that a value is always available. Now, a value will not be available for injection under the following circumstances. Now, there are times when you are using Provide-inject and you just realize that you are expecting, right? You are expecting that a value should be injected. You are expecting that there should be something. This variable that I've declared here, it should have something to render. It should have something. But there are times when it will not just work. And we're going to sort of explore those case scenarios where inject does not seem to return any value that gets assigned to username. One of those instances is when the provide method has the key, has the expected key, but no value was provided. So what does that mean? So if I go back to parent and I actually provide username, but I don't supply it any value. If I save, right, I come back here, you see that there's nothing rendered on the screen. Now notice this, if you go back to grandchild, you see that, yeah, it is expecting username, but it also has a default value. Now, if you notice, the default value is not being used here. Now, the default value, and this is very important, the default value will not be used if the key that you are expecting was actually provided. If the key was actually provided, the default value will be ignored. In that instance, inject will be depending on the parent component to actually supply it a value. The only time that the default value will be used is when that key was never ever there. Like for example, let's say provide was supplying something else, right? Then the default value will be used because now what was expected was never provided. So something else that was provided. So inject will fall back to the default value. But if what inject is expecting is actually provided, then the default value will be neglected. And that's not, so now username is not actually rendering anything. And if the developer consuming the component even checks the console, no error message, like there's nothing, no error handling, nothing, you'll be like, why is this not working? So that's the first case scenario when, no value will be available at all for injection. Then the second time that there might be no value is when the expected key is not provided and the consuming component did not provide a default value. You get, so the first case scenario that we discussed is we actually provide a key, but we did not supply it, a value. Even if we did provide a default value, it will be ignored. The second case scenario is that this guy was never provided. So the expected key was never provided. Let's say it was something else that was provided. Yet the consuming component did not provide a default value. So you don't get to see anything. So this guy right here will be undefined or ignored. It just will not have any value. So but the question is, how do you prevent this? How do you ensure that a value is always available? One of the ways you can ensure that a value is always available is to create a function, right? A wrapper function around inject. And the beautiful thing is that you don't have to create this wrapper function many times. You can just have it once. You can save it in a file. So, in Vue.js, in composition API, there's this concept of having reusable functions. And most of the times, the reusable functions are inside it. We usually keep them inside a folder called composables. So here, what I've done is I've created a composables folder, and then I have created this reusable function called use require injection. So what does it do? This guy is the imports inject, creates a function that accepts two arguments, the key and the default value. Remember that inject usually accepts, two values, right? The key that we are thinking was injected, and then the default value. So use require injection accepts those two guys, those two parameters, and then it passes them down to inject. So key and default value, and then the return value gets the result gets stored inside of value. Then this function now goes further to say, if no value is given, if there's no value, right, throw an error. A value must be provided. Else, so what in JavaScript, when you throw an error, everything after this line does not, the JavaScript engine will not get down here. So, but if value was provided, then it means this check will not, the JavaScript engine will not enter this check. It means that a value has been provided and it will just return the value. So you can use this function across all your applications where you are using Provide-inject to ensure that this guy here always has a value, whether it is provided by the parent component or whether it's actually the default value, but there has to be something here. So if we now sort of apply this in our application, right? So let me just create a composables folder to sort of demonstrate this. The title of folder. Do I have a composables folder already? Oh, okay, yeah. So I have a composables folder already. So I'm going to create a file. Let me call it use require injection.js. This can be called anything. So what it does is that it imports. I'll just import. I'll import inject from Vue, and then I'll just create a function called use require injection. Right, and at the end, I'm going to export the function. So export default. So the function is going to accept the key and then the default value. So we can just initialize the default value as null because it's optional. If this was a TypeScript application, I would have just said it's optional, but this is JavaScript, so yeah. So what this will now do is to say const value is equal to inject, and then I'll pass in the key, and then I'll pass in the default value. Right, and then I'll check if there is no value, throw an error. value must be provided. If there is a value, so at this point, if there is no value, by the time it throws the error, so if there's no value to enter this if block, after throwing the error, it will not get down, it will not like continue. It's just the application just like throw the error and all of that. But if there's a value, then this if block will not be returned. So at this point, we are sure there's a value, so we can just return it. Okay, so what I can now do is I can now go to my grandchild where I am actually using Provide-inject. Instead of importing inject, I can just instead import use require injection. So import use require injection from composables use require injection, right? And then I will now use it instead of using inject directly. I'll just use this function. So let's see the difference. So if I save now, can you see? So unlike before when there was no error, I didn't get the data that I needed, but I also did not get any error to be sure that something happened. But now it actually throws an error that value must be provided. So now I cannot think, okay, why is it throwing this error? Okay, what if I provide a default value? So test. So if I refresh this and then, so now the default value is provided and everything works. Or what if as at the time that I got the error, right? As at the time I got the error, what if I forgot to actually provide? Then I can now, come here and say, okay, the key that I needed is username, and then I want to give it this guy, this reactive variable username. Then I save, and then if I refresh, and then I have this. So using this wrapper function can actually be better, right, than just using inject directly. So this wrapper function, we always ensure that the value that you are trying to it always ensure that inject actually supplies you value. If it doesn't, it should just throw an error to alert the engineer that, okay, something is wrong and get to fix that. So that's how you can always ensure that a value is supplied, because sometimes values cannot be supplied if these two conditions, either of these two conditions are met. Now updating the injected value. So so if you notice, we are providing a value and then we are receiving the injected value. But what if this child component, right, wanted to sort of update this value? So let's say, I want to click a button that will change username, right? Now that can be done anywhere, right? You can do it from here. So here, for example, I can have a button. In the parent, I can have a button. I would say change username. On click, change username, right? And then I can change, and then I can, call the function here. The function accepts a value and then set username value is equal to value. So when you use ref, you always need to say dot value, right? So what this change username does, it receives an argument and uses it to set username. So let me come here and let's say our new username is Evan123, right? So if I click this, right, so from the parent component, I can actually update the state, and I'm updating it from the parent, and the child is responding directly. Also, I could have moved this function into the child, and then have a button in the child to do the mutation. So let me just comment this one out. Instead, I could be doing the update functionality from where I am consuming it. So I can come here and then I can, yeah. So from the child component, I can actually, so let me just refresh. So from the child component, I could be doing the mutation. So this means that you can update the state from the parent or from the child. So the question is, which one is better? Now, one of the things you need to understand as a programmer is that it's not just about making things work. If you want to stand out as a software developer, it is good to make things work, but it is also good to follow best practices, right? Because the code is working, the application is functioning, does not mean that you've done everything right. You should always ask yourself, which am I following best practices? So when you are using Provide-inject, it's always better that the update is coming from the parent. So you remember that the parent is the one supplying the data. The parent should also be the one updating, changing the data. Okay, so as a best practice, the injected value must be updated from the parent component that provides the value. Okay, so, but the question will now be, what if my child component needs to have a button that we do the update from there? What if based on the UI design, based on the way the application should work, what if the child component needs to have some sort of functionality that should update the injected data? Yeah, very simple. All you need to do is the function. So now what that means is, what if we needed to have this button in the child to do the update? What we can do in that case is, this function that is being used here should not be defined in the child. Instead, it should be defined in the parent, like we've done, right? It should be defined in the parent. Then, so let me just move this up. Then what you can do is, in addition to supplying the data to the child, also supply the child the function that it needs to update the data. So what I can now do in that case is, I can now, instead of passing username, I can now use an object. So I'm supplying data via this key, but now I'm supplying an object. So I can now say I'm supplying username, which is username, and then I'm supplying change username, which is change username. So I'm supplying an object. Right now, if depending on the level of your JavaScript, you understand that if you have key and value that are the same, you can just omit this. And behind the scenes, it's actually username. Since I have key and value that are the same, I can just omit this. And behind the scenes, it's change username. So what I've done here is that the child, by design, the child component needs to update the state that was injected to it. But it is not good to define the functionality inside of the child. So what I've done here is to create the functionality from the parent, and then in addition to the data, inject the functionality as well. So what the child can now do is, instead of now, so now what the child can now do is, since I'm supplying an object, if I save this, right? If I save this, I think I've not saved the parent. So if I save this, you can see that what we are receiving is an object. So what I can now do is, instead of using in the child component, instead of just using username, I can do what is known as destructuring. So I can receive username, and then I can also receive the function that was provided. Right? Now, if I save this, so this is the username that I'm picking out from what was injected, and this is the function that I'm also picking out from what was injected. So now I can use both of them. I can now use the username here, and then I can use the function here. And if I save this, let's see if that works. So if I refresh, this is the user, this is the data, and the function still works. So it's always a good practice to avoid changing the data, like defining the function that changes the data from the child. Instead, define it in the parent so that there's the flow of data is unidirectional. Parent down, data and method, data and function are both coming downwards. So as a best practice, the injected value must be updated by the parent component that provides the value. So here, the parent component defines the function, injects both of them, the child component destructures both of them, and then gets to use them. Creating read-only injected values. But it is actually possible, like you saw earlier, it was possible for the child component to change the state, but you can prevent that, right? So you can make the data that you are sending to the child to be read only, meaning that if the child component defines a function internally to change the data, you can ensure that that function does not work, right? And to do that, so for example, like we initially did, so let me just go back to sort of demonstrate this. Yeah, let me also go back here. Username. So going back to the grandchild. Okay. So going back to the previous example that I was trying to talk about, so the parent supplying this, and then the child is accepting it, and then the child defines a function internally and is using the function to change the state. So just to test that out. But you can prevent this. So the way to prevent this is the parent component that is providing the value can also import something called read-only. And then it can now wrap this guy around read-only. What this does is it is enforcing that the child component should not be able to change this. So now if I go back and I refresh, right, internally the child component has its function, and when it clicks, nothing is happening because it is read-only. So the parent component is protecting the data that it is supplying. So it's a good practice that whenever you're using Provide-inject, since it is not good to change the state, to change the data from the child, having the child have its own function, you can enforce it by just wrapping the state around read only. So here we're importing read only, and then we're just using it to wrap whatever we are supplying. So therefore, if the consuming component tries to update username internally, an error will be thrown and the update action will not be successful. I don't even think an error was thrown. So I don't think Vue.js throws an error. So let me just check again. Yeah. Okay, yeah, there's an error. But it's a warning actually. Set operation on key value failed. Target is read only. Yeah, it's a warning. Okay. Maybe I will just update my slide to sort of think I have a slide here that says or an error will be thrown. I can just say a warning. Just to correct my slide. And then yeah. So yeah, a warning will be thrown and the update action will not be successful. Okay, now avoiding key naming collision. So far we've seen how to create, how to use, we've seen what Provide-inject is all about. We've seen the problem that Provide-inject helps us solve or helps us to avoid, the problem of prop drilling. We've seen how to use Provide-inject, how to provide default values, how to create a wrapper function that will ensure that we always have a value injected. We've seen how to update the states, that you can update the state from the parent or update the state from the child. And then we saw that, okay, the fact that you can do this does not mean it is good. Implement a best practice where even if the child is going to update the data, the functionality should be coming from the parent. And then we saw read-only, how you can enforce that rule. So these are like the most those are like the ins and outs of Provide-inject. However, when you use Provide-inject, you might come across a challenge, and the challenge has to do with collisions in the naming of your keys. So far, if you check our code, what we use to sort of inject what we let me just, yeah. So what we use to inject the values is usually a string called username. It's usually a string, username or whatever, but a string. Now, the issue, the challenge with using strings is that you must make sure that you don't repeat this name, because if let's say I want to provide again to this guy, and then I go ahead and use a string and I say username. Sorry. And then I use username and then I say, Jamie, or let's say not even, let me just call it test, right? And in my child component, what I was intending, let me maybe move this up since this is, yeah. So in my child component, what I really, really wanted to consume was this guy, that Fred 123. Okay, but now if I check my code, I'm seeing, let me refresh this. So let me go back. Parent. Okay, let me see. Grandchild, username. I'm expecting this to, okay, yeah. JavaScript moves from top to bottom. So this is overriding. So let me move this up. Yeah, test. So the one down overwrote the one up. So it is possible that in the child component, what I really, really wanted to render was this guy. That's that's Fred 123. That was what I wanted to render. But what I've done is I'm also providing again a value called test, and I'm using the same key that I used up here. Now there is naming collisions, and this can lead to bugs, right? So in the child component, it is working. Provide-inject is working, but what I'm getting is not what I expected. So this is one of the issues that can arise when you are using strings as your name, as your keys rather. You can enter a situation where you forget that you have used a key before, and then you just get an unexpected result. So how do you curb that? So because this cannot be guaranteed, it's considered best practice to use constants as keys that leverage JavaScript symbol as their values. So as a best practice, avoid using strings as your key. Instead, you can have a separate file called, you can call it whatever you want to call it, but I'm calling it keys.js, right? And then I'm exporting a constant username, and then I'm giving it a value called symbol. Now you can check out symbol in symbol has nothing to do with Vue.js. This is JavaScript. Symbols are like unique identifiers. Okay, so if you use constants that their values are symbols, you can never ever run into key naming collisions. So if I'm doing this, how then do I get to use it? So in the parent component, I can now import this guy, this constant. I can import it, and then I can use it as my key to supply this data. And then in the child component, okay, I can import that constant again. And because it was what was provided, it was the key that was provided, I can now use inject, and then I'll get what I want. Now, this can never ever lead to naming collisions. So just to prove that using symbols work, I can see we're running out of time. Just to prove that this works, so I can just create a file. Let me just call it keys.js. And then I can just say export points username is equal to symbol, right? Now the reason why you can never have naming collisions, one of them is, because I'm let's say I mistakenly create another variable called username. Like cannot happen because I'm using const, right? It's a constant, so you cannot like use the same name over again. And then I can now go into my parent component, and then I can import username from here, and then I can use it as my key to supply the data, right? And then when I in the component that I'm using it, I can import it, and then use it as the key, consume the data. Okay, so if I save it, everything still works. So if I go back to just to confirm, if I go back to the parent, right, I'm using this key to, supply username. My username is equal to Fred123, and then in the child, I'm consuming it and everything still works. So it's better to use constants as your keys rather than using strings to avoid naming collisions. Okay, so finally, what are the alternatives to Provide-inject? The primary purpose of Provide-inject is to avoid props drilling, right? However, there are other alternatives to Provide-inject. If you're using a Vue 3 application, if you're working on a Vue 3 application, you can use Pinia, right? You can also use composable functions, or you can use Vuex. So you can use all these global state management options, Pinia, Vuex, composable functions. You can use them, and you can also use, Provide-inject like we've seen. So the question is, when should you prefer using Provide-inject over these other options? So the best times that Provide-inject outshines these other options, or is preferable over these options, is when you are building component libraries. Now, you must have used a couple of component libraries depending on whether you've built some projects. Like, for example, Vuetify. Vuetify is a component library. Bootstrap Vue is a component library. Internally, these component libraries use Provide-inject. Now, the reason is that when you are building component libraries, for example, if I build a component library and all of you here are installing my component library, I don't have control over your application. In your application, you could be using Pinia, you could be using Vuex. I don't have control over that. Okay, so what I have control over are the components that I'm supplying to you. And it is possible that in my component library, one of the ways you compose components is that you can have a component that uses another component that uses another component. So let's say I have in my component library, for example, I could have a component called table, right? And then the columns of the table can also be a component. I could call it table column. The data, TD, the data in the table can also be a component. I can call it, table data. So I can now have a component tree that is like table, inside of it, table column, inside of it, table data. Internally, to manage state in my component library, using Provide-inject is a very good option because I cannot use a Pinia store, a Vuex store. Those are going to be handled by the consuming applications that I do not have control over. Another time that Provide-inject outshines the other guys is when you're creating plugins. You can check out the Vue.js documentation to understand what plugins are. Plugins are basically we use plugins to provide app level functionality. And there are some plugins you must have even worked with, but you didn't know they were plugins, like Vue Router. Vue Router is actually a plugin. Vuex is actually a plugin. Some of those things that you've used in your application where you get to say app.use, so and so. You install it and you say app.use. Most of those things are actually plugins. You get so, but when so my recommendation would be, I don't know if you've been taught Pinia or if you've been taught composable functions or if you've been taught Vuex. My recommendation would be when you are building a web app, like an app, right? It's you of course you can use Provide-inject like we just did, but you probably would want to consider, one of the qualities of a good developer is having options to get the same thing done. So to get the same thing done, you have options, but you now know when to prefer an option over the other. So you can prefer using Pinia or composable functions of UX, to manage, to avoid props drilling in your web apps. Okay. But when you're creating component libraries or plugins, of course, you have to use Provide-inject. However, does that mean most of the time as a junior, as a young developer, you don't probably even know how to create plugins or how to create component libraries? You are mostly building apps, right? Web apps. So does that mean you should not really practice Provide-inject that we've learned? No. You can be working in a company where you can be working in a company that already has a code base, right? And the code base that you are going to be working on already uses Provide-inject to manage state and to avoid props drilling. So in that case, you have to follow suit and use Provide-inject and do it very well. You could even see that some of them are using strings as their keys, and you can just follow our best practices that we've learned to make things read-only and use constants and all of those things. If you are working on a code base that uses Provide-inject for their application. And even if you want to say, okay, you based on what I just said, that consider using Pinia or composable functions of UX. If what you are building is a web app and not a component library or plugin, you can now say, okay, maybe you want to refactor their code base from using Provide-inject to using these other options. For you to be able to do that refactoring, you obviously need to understand Provide-inject. So understand Provide-inject, go back, practice it, use it in your test projects, and the best way to actually get this thing syncing is to practice. That's how these things get sync. And if you want to learn more, you can check out the Vue.js documentation on Provide-inject. And then you can also check out this article on Vue.dos. You can check out this article on Vue.dos that also discusses Provide-inject. Okay, so these are like two very good references that you should consider checking out. So that's it. That's the end. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, okay, let me even check the chat to see if there are any questions. So I'm done with the class. Hello, Amaka.
Hello, I'm here, Timothy.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much for that class. Thank you. So, guys, do we have any questions? Because the chat is empty. So go ahead to ask your questions. If you need to speak, raise your hand and you'll be asked on mute. So let's go that within the next 2 minutes. Thank you so much, Timothy, for an enlightening section.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah. So guys, if you understood, go ahead to say you understood. If not, go ahead and ask your questions. So
any questions, guys?
Okay, I have none for now. I will okay. All right, any other person? We have Daniel, Victor. If you say doesn't have any other question, let me check the YouTube channel whether we have anyone with any questions there.
Okay.
All right. Okay.
Favored. I don't get your chat, but you said I have none for now. Sorry, I meant I will have. Okay, I don't. That's not clear.
Okay, so we have no questions on YouTube either.
Right. I hope it was this one that there are no questions. I hope it was I hope it was clear. I would really like your feedback, so yeah. I don't know if you I don't know if it was was it difficult to understand, or was it not practical enough, guys? Or was it that you understood everything?
All right, so guys, go ahead and drop your answers on the chat.
I can also send the slides if so you can use that to study later.
Okay, so we don't mind, we can have the slides. Also, the YouTube video is also available, so they can always go back and watch the video.
Okay.
And some of the ask a question. So I'll be dropping. So okay, practice for now. All right. So I'll be dropping Timothy's LinkedIn handle. You can go ahead to connect with him on LinkedIn. I'll also drop it on your Discord room, so you can go ahead and connect with him and ask him any questions you have later on.
All right, Favor. I'm going to send the slide to. I will send the slide to. I'm going to send the slide to Uamaka, and she's going to share it to you all. Yeah, thank you.
All right. So thank you so much, Daniel. Okay, this is Daniel. All right. So thank you so much, Timothy. It was nice having you on this session. Thank you for making out time. We do not take this for granted. So since there are no questions, good night to everyone. Have a lovely night wherever you are. Thank you.